week, Randy, Mediokr and Best Sports Podcast. Thank you for tuning in. This podcast that you're watching right now is powered by Score North Network and their YouTube channel. Now the talk of the town is, should the Minnesota Vikings trade for Antonio Brown? Antonio Brown is trying to force his way out of town, trying to get the hell up out of Pittsburgh and the Steelers organization, trying to force a trade. Doesn't want to be there anymore, talk trash, or really kind of, whether you're saying talking trash or if he says he's talking facts about Ben Roethlisberger, he wants to get out of the Steelers organization. Should the Minnesota Vikings trade for Antonio Brown? Well, he could only make your team better where you could have three legit number one receivers in your receiving core as far as whether you're doing trio sets or whatnot. He could only make your passing attack much better than what it already is. Now, the concerns with Antonio Brown as far as, we shouldn't sign him is three reasons that I've seen the most is, number one, offensive line should be the priority. Number two, cap room. We don't even have enough cap room to sign Antonio Brown. And number three, locker room drama, locker room issues. We'll be sure to address all of those. But when I first saw this come up as far as the Vikings and Antonio Brown, should they or should they not, at first, for me, if I'm going to say no, because I'm kind of leaning on both sides, so really I'm thinking along the lines of both sides, but before I get to what I would ultimately do, there's this. When I would say no, I was thinking along the lines of, if we're going to have a third receiver, yes, Antonio Brown could make this passing attack. He could take it over the top. But I think that third receiver could be addressed with Chad Beebe. I think he showed a lot of flash last year in the regular season and in the preseason, and he's going to cost a heck of a lot less than Antonio Brown would. Now, according to Spotrac.com, Antonio Brown would count just over $22 million against the cap next season. Okay, so Chad Beebe is going to cost a heck of a lot less than that. And number two, Antonio Brown, honestly, he just doesn't seem trustworthy to me. He doesn't seem trustworthy to me at all. Whenever you see a guy go out of their way to dye their facial hair, he dyed his mustache blonde or gold or whatever the hell it is you want to classify it. I don't know, man. Anybody that goes out of their way to dye their facial hair, unless you're like self-conscious about gray hair strands in your facial hair and you're trying to use Just for Men gel and darken it up a little bit, anybody that goes out of the way to dye their facial hair, they're immediately untrustworthy to me. But I'm just kidding. Besides that, honestly, besides the whole Chad Beebe factor, I would honestly lean yes. I would lean yes to, if the Vikings do have the opportunity, if the Pittsburgh Steelers would listen, I would lean yes to going after Antonio Brown. Now, going into those three concerns, if you're against Antonio Brown coming to the Vikings, offensive line being a priority, cap hit, and locker room drama, let's address those three right now. Offensive line. Offensive line, that should be our number one priority. We shouldn't even be thinking about Antonio Brown right now. You're right. You are absolutely right. Antonio Brown would be more of a luxury than a necessity. I think we're good with our receiving core as it is. Laquan Treadwell, he's been a failure. He should never see the field again. Chad Beebe will be just fine. After that, maybe you can bring back Aldrick Robinson. You could bring him back. I don't know. Anything would be an upgrade over Laquan Treadwell. I get all that. The offensive line should definitely be a priority. Now, here's what I will say about the offensive line. Unless you can maybe trade Xavier Rhodes or Anthony Barr or with a pick or something like that for a quality offensive lineman. But the more I think about it, teams aren't giving up. Offensive linemen, good offensive linemen, they just don't come around very often anymore. And teams are going to be very reluctant to give them up. So much so that once they hit free agency, they're more willing to overspend for compared to their actual production, much like a quarterback, kind of like Kirk Cousins, where he may not be worth X amount of dollars, but damn it, he's pretty good. And the drop off from what this guy could do to the next guy is very significant. Look, owners would be more willing to do that. So knowing that teams are going to be much more reluctant to trade away good offensive linemen, the only way that you can address the offensive line is through the draft. And guess what? That's your pot of gold right there, because you can get talent. And number two, they're going to be significantly cheaper than if you were to sign someone in free agency or if you were to trade for an established veteran offensive lineman, a good one, but that costs a little bit more than what you would like to pay. So, for instance, right now, if we were to look at our offensive line right now, because our offensive line is crap, we've already known this. And before I even get into that, why is it that Rick Spielman and Mike Zimmer have been scared, reluctant, or just simply naive to the point to where they just don't address the offensive line? Why can't we address both sides, or why can't we spend equal resources? Why can't we spend a balance of resources on both offense and defense? Why is it that we just have to have this kick-ass defense, and our defense is going to be kick-ass no matter what, as long as you have Mike Zimmer there? Okay, fine. And even if he's not there with George Edwards, I think we can be fine with the personnel that we have. But okay, fine. With the balance of resources, why can't we use those resources across the board for both offense and defense? Why is it that we're sitting here saying year after year after year with Mike Zimmer, we're going to have this kick-ass defense, and let's just have an offense that doesn't make any mistakes? Why is it that we're doing that? We got Stephon Diggs, Adam Thielen, Kyle Rudolph. We got Dalvin mother-freaking Cook. Why are we sitting there saying, just don't make mistakes, dog? That's completely unacceptable. That's unacceptable. That's inexcusable. We can have a dynamic-ass offense and a great defense. Why are we so hesitant to make the offense better? I just don't understand it. But getting back to the offensive line, look at what we got right now. Offensive line has been crap. The two maybe stalwarts that you can say we have right now that are, at least one is for sure a shoe-in, that's Brian O'Neill. He's our future right tackle. Number two, assuming that Pat Elflein comes back and returns to 2017 form, his rookie year, that's two staples that you have in your offensive line right there. The rest of the other three spots, the left tackle and the two guard spots, those are up for grabs. And best case scenario, Nick Easton can come back fully healthy, ready to continue his career from that neck injury and return to 2017 form. And in that case, you've got three staples on the offensive line, at least for 2019, to where, okay, now you've got the left tackle spot and one guard spot to address in the draft. If that's the case, now even if Nick Easton doesn't come back, because that's a pie in the sky, it's a sort of pipe dream type of situation, if you will. If he can come back, that's a luxury, and he's going to be a free agent. Nick Easton is. So I wouldn't imagine he's going to have a big market because teams are going to be reluctant on him. You can offer him maybe the veterans minimum and see what you can do from there. But assuming he doesn't come back, that's three spots you got to address in the draft. I think you can address two of those starting spots in the draft. I'm looking at guys like Dalton Risner or Cody Ford out of Oklahoma. That's a guard spot and a left tackle spot right there, to where the other guard spot, if you were to get both of those guys, they're both in the first round. I get it. And that's where it comes to Rick Spielman. You need to be aggressive. Don't sit here and tell me that Rick Spielman cannot be aggressive. We saw that when he traded for Sam Bradford after Teddy Bridgewater went down. What was that in 2016, if I'm not mistaken? Teddy Bridgewater had that horrific knee injury, went out basically damn near, basically being hyperbolic at this point. Basically damn near the next day, went out and traded for Sam Bradford. Don't tell me that Rick Spielman can't be aggressive. You need to keep that same energy like you did with Sam Bradford. You need to keep that same energy in the draft. I don't want to hear nothing about let's keep trading back and let's just stockpile draft picks. Let's get 10 draft picks. And I don't know, 4 or 5, maybe 6 of them are just completely unusable. But hey, we're just stockpiling draft picks. You need to basically trade up in the draft. Keep your 18th pick, but also see what you can do to trade up. You've got the 2nd round pick. You've got the 3rd round pick. You got Anthony Barr. You got Xavier Rhodes. Now, the franchise tag, you can officially franchise tag your players as of today on Tuesday. So what I've been saying all along is you can franchise tag Anthony Barr and then trade him. You can go ahead and trade him. Okay, so those are 4 players or 4 assets that you can use to maybe move up into the 1st round. So if you can do that and make that move, get a Cody Ford or a Dalton Risner, that would be really, really good for this offensive line. Suddenly you're doing a complete 180 from night and day or night to day with this offensive line to where it can be respectable, okay? And then not only that, according to Spotrac.com, as far as the cap that you're going to need, just looking off, not even counting if you're trading up maybe a 2nd round or a 3rd round pick paired with an Anthony Barr or whatever it is to get a higher 1st round draft pick to pair with your 18th pick overall. Let's just look at the Minnesota Vikings overall. Their 5 picks in the draft for 2019. 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 6th round picks in 2019. So you got 5 picks overall. That's going to be a total estimated cap, according to Spotrac.com, of about $5.25 million. So if you can address the offensive line with 2 picks in the draft 2019 and the rest of your picks overall, $5.25 million, that's really doing something. Number 2, as far as the cap hit, Antonio Brown, he's going to cost $22 million against the cap. And, it's funny, before that got brought up, when I saw that, should the Vikings trade for Antonio Brown? At first I was like, I could kind of lean towards yes. Then I went on Spotrac.com. I looked at his contract. Again, I mentioned this earlier, just over $22 million against the cap. And to that I said, woo, hell no. Sorry, I can't believe I entertained that for 30 seconds. Forget that. Absolutely not. We do not need a $22 million wide receiver. For all that matter, Stephon Diggs is Antonio Brown. They're basically the same receiver. Shifty route runners. They can run every single route in the book, super fast, and can catch everything. Just throw them the ball, and they will come down with it no matter what. So they're basically, you got a poor man's Antonio Brown with Stephon Diggs. I would argue, now I know this may be a hot take. I'm really not trying to do a hot take right now. I would argue that with a consistent offensive line and with a quarterback that has time to throw, I think Stephon Diggs could have the production like an Antonio Brown. Now, if you got Adam Thielen right there to take off the pressure off Stephon Diggs, but Stephon Diggs is basically Antonio Brown 2.0. You don't need to pay just over $22 million for that against the cap. And then I did a little bit further digging to that. According to sportingnews.com, okay, so this is according to sportingnews.com. If the Pittsburgh Steelers were to trade Antonio Brown before June 1st, the Pittsburgh Steelers would owe just over $21 million against the cap. So they're not going to do that. So even if they trade him, let's say right now or before June 1st or up to June 1st, they would still owe $21 million. It would be $21 million in dead cap for Antonio Brown. They're not going to do that. However, if they were to trade Antonio Brown after June 1st, so June 2nd or later, the Pittsburgh Steelers would have a dead cap with Antonio Brown. He would have a dead cap of $9.5 million. So the Pittsburgh Steelers would then save $12,625,000. That figure right there, $12,625,000, would go to the team that trades for him. Now, when you look at that, as far as how the Minnesota Vikings could fit that in their roster, I went on Spotrac.com. You can do this. You can do this yourself, okay? They have this really cool GM tool. If you've been following my podcast for a while, I always refer to this. When I'm talking about possibly making things happen, Patrick Peterson, he was possibly going to be on the trade block earlier in the 2018 season. I want to get traded. I want to get traded. And I formulated, I was like, okay, this is how the Minnesota Vikings can do it. Here's how the Minnesota Vikings can trade for Antonio Brown as far as making cap room to trade for Antonio Brown. So according to Spotrac.com, the Minnesota Vikings, as it stands right now, has just over $5 million in cap room. That's obviously not going to get it done for Antonio Brown. But here's what they can do. I mentioned Xavier Rhodes as a trade piece. I'm not trying to sit here and say I'm done with Xavier Rhodes. He could certainly come back, but the way I see it, the money that he's owed, that big contract that he has, and the drop-off that he had in 2018, I'm not going to sit there and take that risk for him to suddenly bounce back and return to form in 2019. I think this is the opportunity where you can get good value for him, where some coach across the league will say, I can bring him back to form like he was in 2017. But if he goes 2 straight years, 2018 and 2019, where he just falls apart, then his trade value goes significantly down. I think right now you can convince a team, hey, you got a shutdown corner. You can pair him with whoever the hell. And you know what's funny? Speaking of which, this is like my pie in the sky sort of trade rumor. I saw this on Bleacher Report. They did a mock draft, right? So this was done by... Goodness, this was done on Bleacher Report by, I'm trying to get this guy's name. This was done by Brent Sobleski. Okay? So Brent Sobleski of Bleacher Report, he did a 2019 mock draft. And he has the Arizona Cardinals selecting quarterback out of Oklahoma, Kyler Murray. And to that I say, you have lost your mind. Not necessarily Sobleski, but if the Arizona Cardinals, because I've seen this come up a couple of times, their new coach, Kingsbury, what he likes Kyler Murray, would he trade or would he draft him and all that stuff. And to that I say, if you are really willing to move forward from Josh Rosen, you're willing to trade him. And I must admit, I'm a phony because last week I said I would not draft Kyler Murray if he fell to the Vikings because you don't need to put that pressure on Kirk Cousins. And he says he's 5'10 or 5'11. He's probably more close to 5'9.5, 5'10 on a good day. Athletes are never what they list as their actual heights on websites. But I think Josh Rosen is going to be a good star. The problem with the Arizona Cardinals is they didn't have good pass protection. They didn't have a good offensive line. All bets are off. If y'all are willing to trade, if the Arizona Cardinals are willing to trade Josh Rosen, then sign me up. My pie in the sky trade rumor will be, hey, we'll send you Xavier Rhodes, and let's say, I don't know, we'll pair like a third-round pick. Either this year's or next year's third-round pick. You'll have Patrick Peterson. You weren't willing to trade Patrick Peterson, right? He wanted to get traded. Oh, we're going to stand pat, and we're going to keep him. I was like, man, you should probably trade him, get some value for him, because he's only going to keep getting older, and you have a young team right now with Josh Rosen leading the pack. But no, you weren't willing to trade Patrick Peterson, right? So you find him valuable, right? You compare Xavier Rhodes with Patrick Peterson, and oh my gosh, that would give you a chance against the LA Rams and NFC West, baby. And we'll take Josh Rosen from you. Okay, no big deal. But getting back to the point, if you're the Minnesota Vikings, you can free up some significant cap space, and here's how. Number one, you're going to have to trade Xavier Rhodes straight up. With Xavier Rhodes, you're going to save about $7 million. So you're going to take about a $6.5 million cap hit by trading Xavier Rhodes to whatever team he goes to. Number two, if you straight up trade or release Everson Griffin, trade or cut him, because I'd be hard-pressed to find a team that would trade for him after the situation he went through last year. It's nice to see that he did return. But in terms of football, Stephen Weatherly did a really, really nice job. You can move Danielle Hunter from left end to right end, and you could have Stephen Weatherly fill that void of Danielle Hunter on the left end spot. I think this defensive line would be just fine without Everson Griffin, assuming that Stephen Weatherly is able to continue where he left off in 2018. So if you were able to trade or cut Everson Griffin, you're going to save $10.5 million. Then if you restructure Kyle Rudolph, right now he's scheduled to make $7,625,000. I restructured it to where he would make $5 million instead, so you would save a little bit over $2.5 million. Then if you were to cut Mike Remmers, just straight up cut Mike Remmers, you're going to save $4.5 million right there. Then you cut Andrew Sendejo, $5.5 million saved right there. Then if you were to adjust for Adam Thielen, let's say you restructure his contract, because you're going to have to do it, match his salary to Stephon Diggs, $12,468,750, and then trade for Antonio Brown. All that aside, all that included, right? Everything that I just mentioned, the Minnesota Vikings would have just about $18 million in cap space. You can look for it yourself. You can do this all yourself, word for word. Everything that I just said on Spotrac.com, their GM tool sheet that they have. And then the $5.25 million that you're going to need for the draft, assuming that they don't trade up or they don't get another first round pick, a higher first round pick to get Cody Ford and a Dalton Risner. Okay, that $5.25 million, you take that out of the nearly $18 million, that's going to leave you with about $12.5 million in cap space. That's after all those moves and after trading for Antonio Brown. $12.5 million in cap space. That still leaves you room to bring back an Anthony Harris. That still leaves you room to possibly negotiate and bring back a Sheldon Richardson. You have the options. You have the capability to do it if you're the Minnesota Vikings. Again, if this was $22 million straight up, absolutely not. But the fact that he's going to be making Antonio Brown $12,625,000, basically on par with Stephon Diggs and what Adam Thielen would make if you match the same contract that Stephon Diggs was getting. You can absolutely do it. You can still address the offensive line in the draft, and hey, you can still have a chance to be competitive in 2019. Lastly, the whole locker room issue, the locker room drama, oh my goodness, and all this stuff. Mike Zimmer has worked with the Cincinnati Bengals for how long? Okay, before he came with the Minnesota Vikings, all those players that they had over there that was causing all sorts of drama, that's where coaching comes in. That's where leadership comes in. If you're a good coach and Mike Zimmer praises himself as his disciplinarian and all this other stuff, then I have no problem, or I have no reason to not believe that Antonio Brown could be held in check with the Minnesota Vikings. So again, you can make room for the cap. You can still address the offensive line. I think with good coaching and good leadership and good discipline factors out there with Mike Zimmer, you could still hold Antonio Brown in check and you could still be competitive in 2019. So it's very possible. I would lean towards a yes. I'm not going to be all up in arms if they don't. You could maybe bring in a Golden Tate or Pierre Garçon. But if you could bring in Antonio Brown, man, you have 3 legit #1 receivers, and that would take this offense over the top. And you could still give protection for Kirk Cousins. And then if 2019, if everything really falls, then you can really bring everything or blame everything on Kirk Cousins because, hey, we addressed the offensive line. We gave you Antonio Brown. You have no excuses, Kirk Cousins. So anyway, we do this twice a week. Mediokr Best Sports Podcast with Realistic Randy. This Tuesday's podcast on Score North. Saturday's podcast on my YouTube channel. Just search Realistic Randy. Twitter @Realistic_Randy. Facebook @Realistic Randy. We will see you on Saturday.